Hello class, welcome to Chapter 5, Forensics and Physical Evidence. In this chapter, we will explain the requisite steps involved in processing physical evidence correctly from its discovery through to final disposition, identify the common errors in collecting evidence, understand the criteria required to ensure admissibility of evidence in court, list the types of evidence most commonly found in criminal investigations, compare and contrast the determinations that can and cannot be made from fingerprint, DNA, blood, and hair evidence, and describe special collection and processing considerations for the following types of evidence: shoe and tire prints and impressions, tool and tool marks, firearms and ammunition, glass, soils and minerals, safe insulation, ropes, strings, tapes, drugs, documents, laundry and dry cleaning marks, paint, and skeletal remains. The evolution of modern law enforcement has greatly benefited from the development of forensic science, which is just barely over 100 years old, and it dates back to 1910 and the quote-unquote exchange principles set forth by French criminologist Edmond Locard. The primary purpose of an investigation is to locate, identify, and preserve evidence. Forensic science itself is defined as, quote, the application of scientific processes to solve legal problems, and most notably within the context of the criminal justice system, end quote. That was authored by Fantino in 2007. The idea is that criminal activity always removes something from the crime scene and leaves behind incriminating evidence. This remnant of transfer between perpetrator and victim is called proxy data. And you've probably heard this from watching CSI or Law and Order. That the idea is that there's something always exchanged between the perpetrator and the victim. However tiny it might be, there's always something exchanged. The best evidence in the legal sense is the original evidence, all of it that can possibly be collected. Physical evidence is anything, i.e. something that has substance, that helps to establish the facts of a case. Direct evidence establishes proof of a fact without any other evidence. Indirect evidence merely tends to incriminate a person, e.g. a suspect's footprint found near a crime scene. Indirect evidence is also called circumstantial evidence. Extremely small items such as hair or fibers are a subset of direct evidence and are called trace evidence. Evidence established by law is called prima facie evidence. Associative evidence links a suspect with a crime. Associative evidence includes fingerprints, footprints, bloodstains, hairs, and fibers. Corpus delicti evidence establishes that a crime has been committed. Probative evidence is vital to the investigation or prosecution of a case, tending to prove or actually proving guilt or innocence. And remember, since a lot of times forensics is based around the most violent of crimes, that evidence needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt. That's how important this step is. Material evidence forms a substantive part of the case or has legitimate and effective influence on the decision of the case, as I just mentioned. Relevant evidence applies to the matter in question. That would be like incriminating videotape, etc. And competent evidence has been properly collected, identified, filed, and continuously secured. Let's talk about crime scene investigators. There's a phenomenon that I'm certain you've noticed called the CSI effect, and it's a phenomenon that has been depicted by Hollywood and has created a glamorized yet impractical image of the field. Obviously, for issues of time compression, a full murder investigation and all the forensic evidence that would be associated with it in real life cannot possibly be covered in a single episode of CSI. So many crucial steps that you probably aren't familiar with will be discussed in this class. So it's a fascinating field, however, and that's why people are so taken with it. As far as crime scene investigation, as CSI develops, processes and packages all evidence found at the crime scene This is what a crime scene investigator does, and then transports it to the lab for forensic evaluation, attends and documents autopsies, and writes reports and testifies in court about the evidence. The CSI effect we already talked about, and it's been in fiction as well. The average juror has become, because of the CSI effect, increasingly technologically sophisticated, and also because of the internet. So their expanded familiarity with technology is more likely due to the general persuasiveness of and exposure to consumer-level technology, including its ability to scour the internet for information pertaining to scientific evidence. That is the result of watching certain television shows, movies, books, etc. This finding has led to the identification of a more general tech effect, a broad public awareness of and familiarity with the capabilities of modern technology that is indirectly influencing juror expectations. But as I mentioned before, a single CSI episode is time compressed, so juries think that DNA evidence is just a snap. Well, no, it's much more complicated, and it takes a lot more time and a lot more lab time, medical examiner time, etc., than what jurors have come to expect. So a sharp district attorney will make sure to educate the jury and make them understand that television, movies, and books may be based on real life, but here's real life that we're talking about now, and this is what happened in the particular case he's prosecuting. Let's talk about investigative equipment. The equipment needed for each type of investigation will vary, most likely because of circumstances potentially, or weather, etc. However, investigators and officers need specialized equipment to properly process various crime scenes. Some examples that would be at every scene would include cameras, chalk, containers, fingerprint kit, labels, magnifiers, measuring tape, notebooks, paper, pens, and other equipment listed in the text, which we also talked about in an earlier chapter. More expensive and elaborate equipment is also needed, such as more elaborate cameras and laptop computers, which may or may not be available at a scene. If it's a rural municipality, they might not have that equipment directly on hand. So that's why the state FBI or the State Bureau of Investigation might step in and assist, for instance. In terms of selecting equipment, work with other organizations to identify what is needed. It is helpful to contact other law enforcement agencies to determine what equipment they use and what they suggest for purchase. Select what you want to have for your organization. Investigators know best what is needed and what is needed by the organization. In terms of equipment containers, equipment may be stored in one or more containers. The equipment needs to be carefully cared for so it will work when needed, and the purchase of specialized containers will help. The containers need to look professional. It is important that investigators make use of professional containers and equipment to create a consistent image. In terms of transporting equipment, there are many possible ways to transport equipment to a crime scene, from the use of a police car to a specially equipped vehicle. A mobile crime lab is generally a specially equipped van that contains the type of equipment needed to process most crime scenes. Training equipment use occurs because most failures during use of equipment are because of lack of training given to those using it rather than problems with the equipment itself. Crime scene investigators need to examine the scene carefully before entering it, but training, which is something you've probably heard before, is absolutely crucial. A key thing is crime scene integrity and contamination of evidence. And if you go back to the earliest part of the O.J. Simpson trial, that's technically where everything went wrong. Sloppy forensics put just enough of a tiny seed of reasonable doubt in the jurors to have them not produce a not guilty verdict, even though the evidence was pretty overwhelming. Sloppy forensics is what lost that case. So let's talk about this. The value of evidence is directly affected by what happens to it immediately following the crime. The crime scene must be cordoned off, and maintaining evidence integrity is super important. Integrity of evidence refers to the requirement that any item introduced in court must be in the same condition as it was when it was found at the crime scene. This is documented by the chain of evidence, also called the chain of custody, which is documentation of what has happened to the evidence from the time it was discovered until it is needed in court, including every person who has had custody. Recalling Locard's principle of exchange, the very act of collecting evidence, no matter how carefully done, will result in a post-crime transfer of material contamination. The value of evidence may be lost because of improper collection, handling, or identification, and that's what I mentioned. That's why I mentioned the O.J. Simpson case in particular. It was the integrity of how the forensics were handled and the materials collected at the scene were handled that lost that case. Now, in terms of discovering or recognizing evidence, to determine what is evidence, first consider the apparent crime. Then look for any objects unrelated to or foreign to the scene, unusual in location or number, or damaged or broken, or whose relation to other objects suggests a pattern that fits the crime. Sometimes it is difficult to recognize items as evidence. Investigators need to consider the type and nature of the crime and carefully examine what items are in the area of the crime scene. Plain view evidence can be seized legally without a warrant. Recall also that the Brady Rule requires law enforcement to gather all evidence that helps establish guilt or innocence. A standard of comparison is an object, measure, or model with which evidence is compared to determine whether both came from the same source. Now, forensic light sources, or FLSs, which work on the principle of ultraviolet fluorescence, infrared luminescence, or laser light, can make evidence visible that is not otherwise detectable to the naked eye, such as latent prints, bodily fluids, and even altered signatures. Ultraviolet or UV light is the invisible energy at the violet end of the color spectrum that causes substances to emit visible light. This is called fluorescence. Lasers can also assist in investigations through trajectory analysis, measurement, and evidence collection. TRACER is an acronym. It stands for Trace Evidence Recovery. You want to be sure you have a very careful system and complete system of marking, identifying, and collecting evidence. You need to mark, log, and photograph and collect all objects. This requires a lot of judgment and care, and exercise that judgment when gathering evidence from the scene, because even the most seemingly insignificant item could be a key piece of evidence. Make sure you avoid cross-contamination, and we'll talk about packaging in just a moment. And you want to make sure that each piece is tagged and identified, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. So some of the common errors in collecting evidence include not collecting enough of the sample, not obtaining standards of comparison, not maintaining the integrity of the evidence. What they mean by not obtaining standards of comparison is if you have, let's say that there's a scene and there happens to be a brick there, and you find bricks are a standard size, generally speaking, or use something that shows relative size. So you put the item that you're collecting next to something of standard size, so you have a size that's comparable or a standard for comparison. And you want to mark or identify each item of evidence in a way that can be recognized later. Make sure to indicate the date and case number as well as your personal identifying mark or initials. Record in your notes the date and time of collection, where the evidence was found and by whom, the case number, and a description of the item and who took custody. When you're packaging and preserving evidence, you want to package each item separately in a durable container to maintain the integrity of the evidence. Each item should be packaged separately, and there are specific requirements for certain types of evidence. And you're going to be using both plastic and paper forms of packaging, and certain evidence goes in paper and certain evidence goes in plastic, and we'll learn more about that later in this class. And then you want to be sure to preserve evidence on things that are immovable at the scene. So for instance, if there's a vehicle that's going to have to be towed in for forensic examination, obviously the scene should be cordoned off. You want to lay down tarps in the area around the vehicle so that evidence isn't trampled, or if you're expecting weather that could wash away evidence, you perhaps need to wrap the vehicle in a tarp. So each scene's going to be different, so you want to make sure, again, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that you use judgment and care, and that you're well versed on how to properly package and preserve each piece of evidence. There are several modes that are acceptable in terms of transporting evidence, and they include personal delivery, where things are taken from a crime scene to a lab, for example, in an official vehicle. Registered mail, insured parcel post, air express like Federal Express and UPS. Those are all legal ways to transport evidence, but you want to make sure that on the shipping label you always check the box or boxes, and you can even handwrite and highlight or underline that the person receiving the evidence has to sign for it. When you're storing evidence, that storage must be secure and free from pests, insects, and excessive heat or moisture. Now, managing this property or this evidence is becoming increasingly challenging, because as technology grows and we're using things like DNA, it requires more evidence to store. So there's got to be plenty of room for all of that to be handled. And all of that evidence is held and stored for longer periods of time. And one reason for that is because, for example, as scientific advances in DNA technology have accelerated, it has caused many state legislatures to extend or eliminate statutes of limitation on the amount of time evidence can be stored. A major crime scene investigation might generate as much as 200 pieces of evidence. And the amount of property that must be tracked and stored in metropolitan departments is typically 100,000 to 400,000 or more items. It's a huge quantity. But there are automated systems too that help maintain the chain of custody, and that includes use of labeling with barcodes, handheld computers, and portable printers, and they help tighten up that chain of custody and management. To ensure admissibility of evidence in court, you must be able to, or the prosecutor must be able to, identify the evidence as it was found at the crime scene, describe exactly where it was found, establish its chain of custody from discovery to the present, which would be in court, and voluntarily explain any changes that have occurred in the evidence. You might be required to do that, or someone from the medical examiner's office might have to provide that kind of information. There are a couple of cases that apply here. Under Fry versus United States in 1923, whether the science to process the evidence was acceptable under the quote-unquote general acceptance of the scientific community was a precondition to the admissibility of scientific evidence. However, under Dambert versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals in 1993, which uses federal rules of evidence rather than Fry, the material issue is that an expert's testimony must be both reliable and relevant. This is known as the two-pronged Daubert standard. There eventually comes a point where there's a final disposition of evidence, and when disposing of evidence, it must be legally disposed of. In other words, biological materials probably require incineration. There are sometimes items that are returned to the owner, but that has to be cleared through the courts, etc. Items can be auctioned and sometimes ultimately destroyed. It is worth footnoting that in things like murder, in cases like murder, where there is no statute of limitations, obviously evidence will not be disposed of. It will be held on to until the case is completely adjudicated. In the next few slides, we're going to be discussing frequently examined evidence. Examining physical evidence often involves the use of biometrics, which is the statistical study of biological data. And labs that process this kind of evidence should be accredited, and they're not only accredited in the state they're in, they're usually accredited with a federal accreditation as well. And the labs use what are called class and individual characteristics. Class characteristics are the features that place an item into a specific category. Individual characteristics are the features that distinguish one item from another of the same type. Now, fingerprints are one form of biometric data. And at the end of each human finger on the palm side, there is a unique arrangement of small lines called friction ridges. These ridges leave prints that are unique to the person. There are different kinds of prints, and one type are latent prints, and these are not readily seen but can be developed through powders or chemicals. And you use a dark powder on a light colored surface and a light powder on a dark colored surface to raise the latent print. And latent prints are normally left behind on non-porous surfaces like granite countertops or glass, for example. Visible fingerprints are made when fingers are dirty or stained. They occur primarily on glossy or light-colored surfaces, like I just mentioned, and they can be dusted and lifted. Another form of fingerprint is what's called plastic fingerprints, and this is one form of visible print, and they're fingerprint impressions that are left in soft substances such as putty, grease, tar, butter, or soft soap like bar soap. Those are just a few of many possibilities where you might find those kinds of prints. And because they're on soft substances, they cannot be dusted, but they are photographed with super high resolution cameras using different spectrums of light. Now, when dusting for latent fingerprints, you want to be careful not to use too much powder, because then you overprocess the print or the latent print. And what that means is if you overwhelm the print with powder, you're hitting the ridge lines, but if there's too much powder, it ends up filling up the spaces between the ridge lines also, and the print becomes unusable. When lifting prints, as I mentioned before, you want to use black lifters or powders for light colored surfaces, and then light colored powders for dark surfaces. There is a process that's called chemical development of latent fingerprints, and this is used for unpainted wood, paper, cardboard, or other absorbent surfaces. And then there are other methods of lifting prints. There's one technique called a magnabrush technique, and a magnabrush can be used to apply magnetic sensitive powder. This kind of brush has no bristles, so the chance of the print being damaged are greatly reduced. There's also laser technology that can be used for lifting prints. Gelatin can be used to lift prints, and superglue, which is cyanoacrylate. Now, a couple of words of caution. When dusting for fingerprints, it can sometimes destroy part of the prints, and depending on whether or not you can use it, that's where the magnabrush has become a good tool to be used. In addition, conventional fingerprinting methods may use liquids or vapors that might alter the prints. So once that's been used, the prints are unusable from that point forward. There is some new technology being applied to fingerprints, and that is called microbeam X-ray fluorescence, or MXRF. And this rapidly reveals a sample's elemental composition by irradiating the sample with a thin beam of X-rays that does not disturb the integrity of the sample. Also, what is done is what's called elimination prints. And if a fingerprint evidence is found at a scene, it is important to know whose prints belong at the scene. So officers who've responded to a scene will leave fingerprints. A person who discovered a scene might leave fingerprints. So their fingerprints are taken and used to eliminate them and distinguish them from prints that are unidentifiable. Inked prints involve the age-old technique, which is a standard procedure, and this standard procedure is to fingerprint all adults who've been arrested either at the time of booking or at the time of release. And you've certainly seen it in books and movies where ink is rolled over the fingerprints, and then the fingerprint is rolled across a card, distinguishing each fingerprint on each finger. Now, we have the advent of digital fingerprinting. You might have heard it called live scan. And this means that advances in computer technology are allowing digital fingerprinting to replace inked printing. Ink printing has its drawbacks because too much ink can be used when the fingerprint is rolled. It can be rolled in such a manner where the ridge lines are not established clearly, etc. Inkless fingerprints are stored in a database or digital fingerprints are stored in a database for rapid retrieval. They go through an automated fingerprint identification system known as AFIS. And then there is the integrated automated fingerprint identification system called IAFIS, and that was developed by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security. Fingerprint patterns analysis and identification mean that normally there are 12 matchable characteristics on a single fingerprint, and that is required for positive identification. So sometimes they find partial prints, but unless there's that minimum number of 12 distinguishing characteristics, it's not admissible in court. but it can help the investigation go in a certain direction. I mentioned that in a usable print, there are 12 matchable characteristics on a single fingerprint, and that is the requirement for positive identification. And these matchable characteristics involve arches, loops, and whorls that are unique on each individual fingerprint, and those are then analyzed and identified through the arches, loops, and whorls. The usefulness of fingerprints is unequivocal. They are absolutely unique to every individual, so they are positive evidence of identity. And if they are processed correctly and you have all of the required, or the 12 matchable characteristics, then they are easily admissible in court. There are other types of prints that have been used or are being used in more recent years, and those include the palm, because the lines on the palm are unique, foot patterns, the base of the foot and toe patterns are unique, and what's called the writer's edge, which is the side of the hand, the outside of the hand, on the opposite side of the thumb. Another form of biometric data are voice prints. A graphic record by a sound spectrograph of the energy patterns emitted by speech are what make up a voice print. And like fingerprints, no two voice prints are alike. Also, what is used is language analysis. The actual language is often an overlooked type of evidence, and this evidence can be captured using digital recorders. And what is considered are the following. One piece of language analysis is that excited utterance made by persons at a crime scene can, upon analysis, reveal the speaker's state of mind and may be admitted into testimony even if the person themselves does not testify in court. To qualify for this exception to the hearsay rule, the victim or witness must have seen an exciting or startling event and made the statement while still under the stress of the event. This is similar to what is called the res juste statement. Res juste is Latin for things done, and it's a term found in substantive and procedural American jurisprudence and also English or British law. In American substantive law, it refers to the start to end period of a felony, but it also refers to a former exception to the hearsay rule for statements made spontaneously or as part of an act. You also have one area of language called Psycholinguistics, which is the study of the mental processes involved in comprehending, producing, and acquiring language. Another form of biometric data is DNA. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is the building block of chromosomes, and this substance is individual to a specific person. This genetic code is used to create what is called a genetic fingerprint to positively identify a person, and it is as unique as a fingerprint, except for identical twins. No two individuals have the same DNA structure on Earth. DNA profiling uses material form which chromosomes are made to identify individuals positively. Law enforcement should use DNA's full potential because the low cost per test in today's technology can also aid in solving high volume crimes such as burglaries and car break-ins. When it comes to identifying, collecting, and preserving DNA evidence, collection is very simple to conduct. The supplies are inexpensive, processing time in the field is minimal, and standards are easily obtained. There are many types of ways to collect this DNA evidence, and one way to do it is to use a sterile cotton-tipped applicator swab. It's inexpensive, easily obtained, easy to carry and store, and are used in scenes and on individuals to collect 4 DNA samples by rubbing the inside surfaces of the cheeks of a suspect thoroughly, then air drying the swabs and placing them back into the original paper packaging or an envelope with sealed corners. You'll see the swabs used at a scene also where there are bodily fluids, just as one example. Plastic containers should not be used for DNA collection because they can retain moisture, which may damage the integrity of the DNA sample. In some cases, DNA analysis has been rendered worthless by the defense's successful attack on the methods used to collect and store the evidence on which the DNA analysis was performed. In regards to DNA testing, there are 2 types of DNA that are used in forensic analysis: nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Nuclear DNA is from blood, semen, saliva, body tissues, and hairs that still have their root bulb at the end. Mitochondrial DNA is DNA, and it is found in naturally shed hairs, hair fragments, bones, and teeth. DNA analysis is difficult with a mixed profile sample where DNA from more than one individual is in the sample. There is a new technique called Y-STR or Y-STR analysis that is being used in cases where you have a mixed profile. It uses the Y chromosome as a male-specific identifier, and typing techniques are now available that develop profiles specific to the male contributor of the DNA. A limitation of Y-STR analysis is that the DNA profile obtained will be identical for all males within the same paternal lineage. There's biogeographical ancestry DNA testing that can be used to include or exclude certain people from an investigation based on their ancestry. A recent case in the last couple of years, a huge case that was solved by use of ancestry or ancestral DNA testing, is the location and apprehension of the Golden State Killer. Now, when it comes to this biogeographical ancestry DNA testing, the question is asked, can suspects be identified by race with DNA? Because DNA evidence has scientifically rigorous probabilities, the chances are far less than 1 in 10 billion for a full DNA profile from a single individual matching that of another individual. So the question as far as identifying race with DNA is unanswered. We think not at this point. But because of the probabilities of DNA matching being less than 1 in 10 billion, it is a solid lock in terms of identification. Now, there is a DNA database called the Combined DNA Index System, and it's called CODIS. Since September 2013, the NDIS Forensic Index contained 514,700 profiles, and the Convicted Offender Index contained 10,581,700 profiles. The Forensic Index contains DNA profiles from crime scene evidence where the offender's identity is unknown. The offender index contains DNA profiles of individuals convicted of sex offenses and other violent crimes. There can be a backlog of DNA awaiting testing. Nationally, the year-end backlog of offender DNA samples has increased steadily from 657,166 in 2007 to 793,852 in 2008, and then to 952,393 in 2009. And what's happened is investigators know to test for DNA now. So they test at every crime scene, but the growth and the capacity of the labs has not been able to keep pace with the pace that DNA is obtained. When it comes to DNA admissibility in court, quote, "Today a DNA match is virtually indisputable in court. DNA can identify a criminal with near absolute certainty or exonerate innocent suspects," end quote. This is according to Prime and Newman, which was published in 2007. Exoneration of incarcerated individuals when it comes to DNA means that data provided by the Innocence Project, which is a group founded at the Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University in New York, reveals that 325 people had been exonerated through DNA testing as of the time that this text, your book, went into print. That number is growing exponentially, but there is a backlog for testing that DNA, just like there is a backlog of DNA testing in new samples that are obtained. There are moral and ethical issues involved. The needs of law enforcement community must be weighed with the public's interest in preserving its own civil liberties. There are other biometric data that are used, and one obviously is blood and other bodily fluids. Blood and body fluids, including semen and urine, can provide valuable information. Semen and saliva may be detected with fluorescent lights, and blood trails or blood spatter can be also useful as evidence. Their new software programs, such as Backtrack, can help analyze blood spatter patterns. Blood is identified at a scene that has been quote-unquote cleaned. In other words, investigators smell the presence of a lot of cleaning solutions, or a scene that looks clean. But if you spray luminol and normal light is blacked out and fluorescent light is used, it will light up like a Christmas tree if there is the presence of blood, and semen will also fluoresce with luminol. Scent can be used. Every person has a unique scent that cannot be masked or eliminated, not even by the most potent perfume. Scent can establish a probable cause for an arrest, and that's where dogs come into play, because they are so sensitive and they can process a vast amount of scents, and they are spot on. Another thing that can be used in terms of biometric data are hair and fiber. Hairs and fibers can place an individual at the crime scene, especially in violent crimes in which evidence is generally transferred or exchanged. Secondary ion mass spectrometry, sometimes just called mass spectrometry, chemicals can distinguish trace hair samples using consumer chemicals as identifiers. Those would be like hairspray, shampoo, etc. Although chemical colorants and other products commonly applied to hair can thwart microscopic analysis, SIMS, or secondary ion mass spectrometry is not affected by such substances and can capitalize on their presence to improve the probability of identification. Shoe prints and tire impressions are frequently used, and these are tracks or marks left by shoes or tires, and they can be specific to the shoe or the tire. So they'll take a tire impression, and like the FBI can trace back that particular tread pattern to the manufacturer and the years that it was available, and that can help narrow a search. And also they can do the same thing with shoe prints as well. Bite marks are used, and sadly, bite marks can be found on the suspect's or victim's body or on anything else placed in the mouth, such as food. Bite mark identification is based on the supposed individuality of teeth and is legally admissible in court, having endured a number of legal challenges. Teeth are also an excellent source of genomic DNA. And for bite marks, there's a specialist called a forensic odontologist that is recommended to be used to analyze bite marks. Tools are often used in the commission of a crime. They can be traced if broken parts are left behind, and also traced by marks caused by the use of a tool. For instance, if a hammer is used, it leaves a distinct kind of mark. Firearms and ammunition, as you well know, are frequently used, and there are many ways to identify both the weapon and the ammunition and whether or not a gun was used. And they include gunpowder tests, which test for the presence of gunpowder at the scene where a victim appears to have been shot, but there are no shell casings readily available. And it also leaves residue on victims' clothing and things like that. There are also shot pattern tests that are used, and functional tests of a weapon can be made and compared as well. Firearm evidence can include bullets, shell casings, slugs, shot pellets, and again gunshot residue or gunpowder, the presence of gunpowder. And when it comes to the firearms, serial numbers are used, and sometimes the serial numbers are shaved off. However, the inside barrel of a gun produces a unique signature on every single casing that is unique to an individual weapon. And if the gun was ever registered, it can be traced back. This is one reason why sometimes perpetrators will collect the shell casings. There are also biological markers that will be found with firearm evidence, including blood, fingerprints, or other forms of biological evidence, like saliva, for instance. There is also a tool called an instant shooter identification kit, and the U.S. Department of Energy's Sandia National Lab has developed and patented a portable gunshot residue, or what is called GSR, field test kit that provides police officers with a presumptive test for gunshot residue in the field, and accurate results are provided within minutes. Glass is another form of frequently examined evidence at scenes, and it can be used for the transfer of evidence and to show where a piece of glass came from at a crime scene. If glass is hit with high velocity, it can be thrown certain distances and in certain patterns. This is well studied, and it will crack and fall apart depending on the kind of glass it is in different ways specific to that glass, again with high or low velocity. And there is a glass evidence reference database that contains more than 700 glass samples from manufacturers, distributors, and vehicle junkyards, and it is a very useful resource for investigators. Although it cannot determine the source of an unknown piece of glass, the database can assess the relative frequency that two glass samples from two different sources or more would have the same elemental profile. Soils and minerals are also frequently, well, almost always used, particularly if there is soil found inside of a crime scene, tracked to a crime scene, just outside of it, or if the crime scene takes place outside. And scientists called forensic geologists can use soils and minerals to determine the origin of, for instance, if a victim is found with sand and there's not sand in the immediate area, they can, however, tell where the sand came from. And they use techniques called X-ray diffraction and microscopes to, X-ray diffraction involves X-raying rocks and other geological types of samples, and that can show the type of rock, where it was formed in a specific geological area. And microscopes are often used in soil samples because the soil includes pollen, needles from trees, leaf stems, bark, the type of soil that is present, etc. Safe insulation is sometimes used. Safes contain insulation that can transfer to a suspect's clothing. This is a crime that was perpetrated more frequently years ago and not perpetrated as often now, but it does still absolutely happen. But since all safes are insulated, that insulation can be found and tracked on a suspect's shoes. For example, as you see, they're checking the sole of a shoe here in this picture on this slide. In terms of ropes, strings, and tapes, these items can be compared either by type or cut ends. And the FBI has a database of rope manufacturer, string manufacturer. It's pretty astonishing, and they can even sometimes narrow down when and where it was produced. Also, fingerprints can occur on either side of tape specifically. So sometimes tape ends can be matched up, but tape lifts fingerprints and is used to lift fingerprints at a crime scene. So unless the perpetrator was wearing gloves, fingerprints can occur on either side of tape ends that are being matched up. If drugs are present at a crime scene, you want to, as an investigator, put drugs into a bottle if they're not in a bottle already, but put them into another container, obviously with gloved hands, and then attach a label to that container. If they're loose, you want to put them in a container and label it, mark that they were loose, how many of them they were, the markings on the tablets, the color and shape. And solid drugs can also, like tablets or capsules, can also be stored in a pillbox as one way of storing and transporting loose drugs. So they can be used put in a plastic bag and marked and identified and labeled. They can be put in a bottle, but they can also be put in a pillbox. If you find documents at a scene, typing, handwriting, and printing on those documents can be compared. One resource that's used is the Forensic Information System for Handwriting, called FISH, which is maintained by the U.S. Secret Service. This database merges federal and Interpol databases of genuine and counterfeit identification documents such as passports, driver's licenses, and credit cards. Make sure if you're handling documents that you never touch them with bare hands because, as we discussed a little while ago, paper is one absorbent surface where prints can be obtained. So you want to make sure that you're always handling everything in a scene, but especially anything that can absorb fingerprints, like documents. You want to make sure that you do not touch them with bare hands. And the documents need to go into a cellophane or a manila envelope, and then identified or labeled on the outside of those storage envelopes and collection envelopes. Here's something that people often are not familiar with, which is the use of laundry and dry cleaning marks as means of identification. Many launderers and dry cleaners use specific marking systems. These can be used for comparisons and to find the business. Paint obviously is tested quite a bit, and paint colors and samples can lead to the identification of an automobile and offer many leads. Paints are complex and individual, and sometimes those samples found at a crime scene, or if a vehicle has struck a painted surface, the paint samples are very tiny sometimes. So you want to make sure that you use small boxes for submitting paint samples to the crime lab. The digital revolution and preponderance of electronic devices pervading everyday life, such as cell phones, pagers, personal digital assistants, yes, they are still used, computers, and global positioning systems, or GPS, has generated an entirely new class of evidence that is now frequently examined evidence, and there are specific requirements for handling it. One of the greatest challenges, or perhaps the greatest challenge in electronic crimes, is the absence of geographic boundaries and the question of jurisdiction. The first part of collecting evidence from a cell phone is the actual handling of the device. Dunnigan and Schroeder, published in 2006, suggest the following basic rules. A, do not change the condition of the evidence. In other words, if the phone is off, leave it off. If it is on, leave it on. Let the lab take it from the condition you find it in. Make sure to look for more devices. Remove any other potential points of evidence, which could include SIM cards, external media, power cables, and data cables. Anything electronic needs to go, and any type of cables associated with any of those digital devices need to go from a crime scene as well. They should all be, remember, tagged, properly identified, where you found it, etc. When it comes to analyzing a cell phone, only a person with specific training must do so. There are digital forensic courses that specifically trained personnel need to go through to be able to search a cell phone. All cell phones leave a trail, and what is meant by that is that global positioning system chips built into cell phones allow authorities to track criminals as well as people in need of help. Each cell phone provider stores and maintains subscriber records, which includes subscriber information such as their name, address, and birth date, as well as call detail records containing data regarding incoming and outgoing phone numbers and the towers that transmitted these calls and the times those transmissions occurred and the length of those transmissions as well. Hopefully you never encounter weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, but they include nuclear weapons, radiological devices, biological agents or chemical agents, and explosives. The testing matrices include aerosols, which is just air, test for radiation and contaminants, etc., liquids, solids, surfaces, and dermal or skin samples. Remember, at any WMD crime scene, however, or potential WMD crime scene, the public's safety always takes precedence over evidence collection, obviously. One of the things to remember is we listed WMDs. Unfortunately, people always think of a better mousetrap. For example, the bombing that took place at the Boston Marathon a few years ago was a pressure cooker with an electronic device, a small explosive, and steel ball bearings and nails. I obviously didn't list that as a weapon of mass destruction, but it clearly, these things were put together to produce one. One of the most common and important acronym you need to remember is what are generally known to be weapons of mass destruction, and that acronym is CBRNE, and this is an acronym for chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive materials. These materials are extremely dangerous and can hurt many people. When they're used on purpose, CBRNE materials are weapons of mass destruction. However, CBRNE events can also happen accidentally. The explosion at the Chernobyl plant in the Soviet Union in 1986 is one example. The accident following the earthquake and tsunami in Japan at Fukushima is another example, but there have been many accidents. Whenever skeletal remains are found at a scene, a person called a forensic anthropologist is used to determine whether the remains are animal or human. And the forensic anthropologist can also reconstruct skeletal remains. And laboratories can determine whether, again, the skeletal remains are animal or human. And they use dental comparisons and x-rays of old fractures on human remains. And these are important identifying features or individual characteristics. Wood comparisons are often possible regarding the type of wood and its origin. With wood, if it's found wet, keep it wet, because it may not just be wet with water, and even if it is water, that water can contain what are called diatoms, which identify the source of the water, or it could be soaked with some other type of liquid. And so if it's wet, keep it wet. If it is found dry, make sure to keep it dry. There are plenty of other random types of evidence found at scenes. And these can include prescription eyeglasses, broken buttons, glove prints, and other personal evidence. These can be examined and compared. And investigators learn to read what is called product DNA, which is the printed code that appears on nearly every manufactured or mass-produced item because it provides valuable leads. Other discarded items at a crime scene that may yield useful information include store and restaurant receipts, bank deposit slips, beverage containers, cigarette packages, membership and check cashing cards, clothing manufacturer labels, and laundry tags and footwear. So I mentioned a while back how about collecting everything at a scene and how the most seemingly insignificant thing can often turn out to be a very valuable piece of evidence. And that's where you find these random items that fall under this category of just things that appear to be discarded. Finally, let's talk about evidence handling in relation to infectious disease. At many, probably most crime scenes, you're likely to encounter infectious bodily fluids. Just assume they're there, even if you cannot readily see them. So you want to use universal precautions, and especially if there's plain evidence, like a lot of pooled blood, for example. You want to use universal precautions, PPE, gloves, masks, etc. You want to consider all body secretions as potential health hazards. Remember that AIDS or the HIV virus is not spread through casual contact, such as touching an infected person or sharing equipment. Tuberculosis, however, is of greater concern. Tuberculosis is highly contagious and requires a solid year of regimen that must be started over, even missing just one single day of medication. It is highly contagious. So it is much more a concern than HIV or AIDS. MRSA or MRSA is a type of staph infection that is resistant to most antibiotics. It is extremely infectious, and it is severe and sometimes deadly. So I mentioned using universal precautions when collecting blood evidence or any other type of bodily fluid. Make sure after you deglove to wash hands thoroughly with soap and water. While processing the crime scene, constantly be alert for sharp objects such as hypodermic needles and syringes. And what I suggest, and what people in labs do when handling potentially or bodily fluids and evidence that could potentially contain the presence of a highly infectious disease, whether it's a virus or bacteria, etc., is to double glove. Use 2 sets of nitrile, which is much tougher than latex. Use double glove with nitrile gloves at the scene, and you want to make sure that you watch out for sharp objects. And a good technique also is to check your gloves carefully as you remove them to see if there's any evidence of puncture anywhere. You want to also make sure that after you've processed a crime scene where there's possibility of infectious disease agents, that the crime scene is decontaminated properly. Now, there are specialists who usually handle this. This will be a broad summary of the large amount of material we covered in this chapter. So we talked about from the beginning of the chapter how criminal investigations rely heavily on various types of evidence. And I have mentioned at least twice what you read here. The more individual the evidence, the greater its value. And what is meant is that even the most innocuous item at a crime scene that may seem like it, is just a piece of random material can be actually the piece of evidence that can lock a case. So the more individual the evidence, the greater its value. So make sure to collect everything. We talked about the importance of marking and identifying each item of evidence and how to do that correctly and carefully and consistently. We also discussed packaging evidence properly and documenting custody of the evidence at every stage, when it was discovered to when it's presented in court. After a case is closed, evidence can be returned to the owner, auctioned, or destroyed. Again, this is a broad summary. We obviously covered a lot of specific material in this class. And remember that this PowerPoint presentation is meant to supplement your study of the text. And I discussed a lot of things that are not on each specific slide, a lot more detail than is listed on specific slides, but is absolutely in your text. So please make sure that your text is your primary source of information, and hopefully this is a good supplemental tool to help you learn and remember all of the things covered in your text. Thank you for all of your time and attention. And if you need any specifics answered or clarified, please do not hesitate to contact your instructor. Again, thank you for your time. We will see you next class.